Okay, these are the questions from 4.1. If you're just starting the questions and you don't know what you're doing, go back and watch the video. It's called SYK for Show You Know on fractions, decimals, and percents, changing all of them to each. So that'll help you understand a little bit about if you're given one, how do you get the other. So the first one says Kaitlyn and Jordan are converting a decimal. So they're going from a decimal to a percent. Kaitlyn said that this number here would be 3%, and Jordan said that this number here, which is the same, would be actually decimal 3%. Who is correct, and show how you know. Well, the first thing both should do is they should say that this number, tenths, hundredths, thousandths, as a fraction is 3 thousandths, right? Because this number actually would be read as being 3 thousandths. And when we look at it as being 3 over 1,000, we know that 3 over 1,000 is not 3%, because 3% is 3 out of 100, right? I'm sorry, that's the 1,000 I wrote. 3% is 3 out of 100. So because this fraction is not 3 out of 100, we know that obviously Kaitlyn is wrong. So because there's only two people, we assume that Jordan must be right. But if we look at this, so because this number is this, what I'm going to do is say, well, 0.3%, percents are out of 100, so 0.3 would be there. And I want to ask myself, are these two things the same thing? So 0.3 out of 100, if I wanted to make it into equivalent fraction out of 1,000, I would multiply by 10, and I would multiply by 10, and I get 3 out of 1,000, which proves that Jordan was correct. That 3 thousandths is really less than a percent. It's 0.3%. Question 2, if it comes up here, it says which number does not have the same value as the other three? So you're given a improper fraction, a decimal, a percentage, and another improper fraction. So what we're going to have to do is convert these all to one type. Now, it doesn't matter what you do. You can change all of these to fractions. You can change all of them to decimals. You can change all of them to percentages. It's up to you. Now, since we're dealing with percentages, I think what we'll do is we'll simply convert them all to percentages, okay? So 12 over 5. I'm going to use the simple method, which is simply take the numerator and divide the denominator to create a decimal. So when I do that, 12 divided by 5 equals 2.4. Oh, well, right away I know which one doesn't belong. I know right away that this one is not the same as the other, but we'll just make sure. We'll just do it anyway. So 2 and 4 tenths would be 2 and 4 tenths, which would be 24 tenths, which would be 240 hundredths by creating that equivalent fraction, which would be 240%. The second one, 2.4, actually, the second one actually picks up in my train of thought right here, right? If I was thinking 2.4, and since 2.4, the train of thought is going to be the exact same thing down all the way there, I know that 2.4 is also 240%. Now, since the third one is 250%, I know that 60 over 25 probably is going to be 240%. So I'm going to just do it anyway, 60 over 25. Okay, I'm going to do this one a little different. I'm not going to use the division method. I'm going to make an equivalent fraction out of 100. Okay, I'm not going to use division. I'm going to multiply. I know that 25 multiplied by 4 gives me that nice, beautiful 100 denominator. And the numerator is going to be 240 period, which means that 240 of 100 is 240%. So, yeah, I was right to begin with. 250% is the one that does not belong there. And that's the proof you would have to show on a test. Question 4, you're given a fraction, in this case 3 of them, and you're asked to make a decimal and a percent from it. So the first one, well, obviously if you're given any fraction and you're given a calculator, the first thing you're going to do is you're just going to go 1 divided by 250 and get your calculator to do the thinking for you. So I got 1 divided by 250 equals 0.004. So that's your answer for that. But let's pretend we didn't have a calculator and you're asked this question. Well, 250 times 4 gives me 1,000. And anytime I can make an equivalent fraction that has a 10 or 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 or 100,000, anything with a base 10 denominator, what that will allow me to do is read the numerator and then write it as place value. So in this case, I have 4 thousandths, and because I have that base 10 denominator, thousandths, this is tenths, this is hundredths, this is thousandths. So 4 thousandths would look like this, right? 4 thousandths would look like this, and there it is right there, right? When I did division, I got that. When I used my equivalent fractions, I got that as well. So either way would be acceptable to show. So for the next one, I'm not going to use division. So I'm not going to go 1 divided by 250. I'm going to figure it out a different way. So my goal is to get it to be a decimal and a percent. Okay. Now obviously I could just go 81 divided by 200. And I'll just do it now just to show you what the answer is going to be. 81 divided by 200 is, oh, that's not right. I did that right. 81 divided by 200, not multiply. And you get 0.405. So the answer as a decimal would be this, but we're not going to use that, right? I'm going to write that down below. 0.405. We're going to figure it out a different way. So again, I have a denominator of 200, and I know I can create an equivalent fraction out of 100. So if I divide by 2, I get that. So I have to divide the numerator by 2, and 81 divided by 2 is 40.5, 40 and a half, which means, I'm going to put this answer over here, which means if it's 40.5 out of 100, as a percentage, since percents are out of 100, that would be 40.5%. But what I also want to have is I want to have it as a decimal, okay? And in order for me to get a decimal from this fraction, I can't have a decimal in my numerator. So I'm going to multiply this by 10 to get 405. And I'm going to multiply this by 10 to get 1,000. And 405 thousandths, tenths, hundredths, thousandths, is 405 thousandths, right? The answer I got at the very first by using division, okay? But I was able to get the same answer and the same percentage without having to do division. And in the last question, 7 over 5, okay? So 7 over 5, I could go 7 divided by 5, and I get 1.4, I think, 1.4. But we're going to ignore that. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get that equivalent fraction out of 100, because I know that 5 times 20 is 100. So if I multiply this by 20, I get 140. Since it's a fraction with a 100 denominator, I know the numerator is the percent, so it's 140%. Which makes sense because we're dealing 7/5 is greater than 1. And since 1 is 100% of something, something greater than 1 would be more than 100%. But the only problem is because it's an improper fraction, I can't read it and write it as a decimal. So if I have an improper fraction, I want to convert it to a mixed and then read it. So 140 hundredths, you can't read it and write it as a decimal, but 1 and 40 hundredths you can. Right? 1 and 40 hundredths is what that is a decimal, or if I want to drop that insignificant 0, I can go 1.4. Question 6 gives you a decimal. It asks you to make a percentage and a fraction. So the first thing I'm going to do is make the fraction, because that's the easiest thing to do. So if I read this decimal, this is tenths, hundredths, thousandths, 10 thousandths. We have 72 10 thousandths. So there's your first answer. Okay, that's it as a fraction. Now, as a percentage, I need to get it to be an equivalent fraction out of 100. So 10,000 divided by 10 would be 1,000. Divided by 100 would be 100. So what I want to do is divide this by 100 to get 100. Divide this by 100, and I get 0.72 out of 100. And since percentages are out of 100, that would make it 0.72%, because percentages are out of 100. Okay. In the second example, 0.548 is 548 thousandths. I just read the decimal properly using place value, which as an equivalent fraction out of 100 would be 54.8, because I divide the top and bottom by 10, which is 54.8%. And the last one, 3.45, is also read as being 3 and 45 hundredths. Tenths, hundredths, 3 and 45 hundredths, which is the same thing as 3, oh, that's not right, 345 hundredths. And since if the denominator is 100, that's a percentage, the numerator is your actual percent, which is 345%. Okay, next one, 230%. As a fraction, is an acceptable answer is 230 out of 100, since it's 230%, or 2 and 30 hundredths, or 2 and 3 tenths in lowest terms. As a decimal, I'm going to use this fraction to help me write it as a decimal because that's its 2 3/10, which is 2 3/10. Now, when you have this number here, some people look at it and think it's 38%, but it's not. Remember, percentages mean as a fraction out of 100. This part goes in your numerator, so it's really 0.38 out of 100, which is less than 1 out of 100. If I multiply top and bottom by 100, I get 38 in my numerator, and I get 10,000 in my denominator. So 38 10,000ths, which is tenths, hundredths, thousandths, 10,000ths. 38 10,000ths goes here. Those have to become zeros. And as a decimal, it's 0.0038. Now, also in a fraction, you should be aware that on a test, usually they ask you to express them in lowest terms. So if I divide both by 2, which is a common factor to both, I get 19 over 5,000, which is the answer in lowest terms. And your last one, as a fraction, 19.9% would be 19.9 out of 100, which is 199 over 1,000, which is in lowest terms, which 199 thousandths, tenths, hundredths, thousandths, there's a thousandth, so 199 has to end there, and I get 0.199. Question number 11 says express the shaded portion of each diagram as a fraction. So treating this as 100% of something, the denominator would be 25, right? There are 25 parts to this fraction, and there are 17 of those parts shaded in. So rather than have the whole thing shaded in, 100% of it, or one full object, I only have 17 parts out of 25 shaded in, less than one of them, which as a percentage I can do without division because I can multiply both by 4. That would be 34. That would be 68 over 100, which we know is 68%. So 60% of that object is shaded in. In the next one, I got to determine my denominator. 4, 8, 12, 16, 20, 24 is my denominator. There are 24 parts. 9 of them are shaded in, I think. So 9 out of 24 are shaded in. Now here, I'm not 100% sure what I multiply 24 by to get an equivalent fraction. So I'm actually going to use the division method. So I'm going to go 9 divided by 24, and that gives me 0.375, which is, as a fraction, 375 thousandths, because I read tenths, hundredths, thousandths, 375 thousandths. And because I need a percentage, I need to change that equivalent fraction out of 100. I need to change it to an equivalent fraction of 100 to get the percentage. Divide by 10 to get that. Divide by 10. I get 37.5 out of 100, which is 37.5%. All right, question 14. It says a snack contains 0.9 grams of fat. Suppose that in one day Sean consumed a total of 40 grams of fat, including the snack. What percent of Sean's total fat consumption does the snack represent? What is this percent as a decimal and a fraction? So the first thing you need to remember is that a fraction expresses a part to a whole. So in this particular case, this whole day was 40 grams of fat. So that's going to be the denominator. And the part we're looking at is 0.9 grams. Now, if I wanted to draw that, let's pretend this was Sean's day. Sean's day was 40 grams in total. Okay, this is 40 grams of fat. Well, this 0.9 grams represents that snack out of the 40 grams in total, right? So it's 0.9 grams out of a 40-gram day. So what I want to first do is want to figure out, well, what is that as a decimal? So I'm going to use method 1, which is simply to take that numerator, oh, that's not right, decimal 9, and divide it by the denominator, and that'll change it into a decimal. So as a decimal, oh, I can't even write properly, is 0.0225, right? So then I need to think about this as a fraction, as a decimal. This is 225 over tenths, hundredths, thousandths, 10,000. So 225 10,000ths. And because I really want to get it as a percentage, I want to divide this by a number that's going to get it to 100. So I want to divide it by 10 twice, or divide it by 100. Divide this by 100. I get that denominator of 100 because 10,000 divided by 100 is 100. And 225 divided by 100 is 2.25, because I'm going to move it 2 places over. which means that that snack is 2.25% of his daily fat intake. Or another way to write this, 2 and 25 hundredths would be 2.25% of his daily fat intake. Both of these answers, this one here and this one here, if you look at them for a second, they are the same thing. And finally, question 16 says, a miner found 12 grams of gold in a 1,200 or 2,700 gram sample of ore. What percent of the sample is gold? So again, just like the last question, so the whole gold bar or ore has 2,700 grams in it. And of that 2,700 gram sample of ore, 12 out of the 2,700 grams are gold. So this is really a fraction, 12 out of 2,700. Again, I'm not going to make equivalent fractions, although I could technically divide this by 27 and divide this by 27, and I'm going to get that equivalent fraction out of 100, right? In fact, I'm going to do that just to see what happens here. So 12 divided by 27 equals 12 divided by 27 equals, oh, what was that? Okay, 0.4 repeating, okay, out of 100. Or I'm just going to write that out as 2 or 3 decimal places. So 0.444 ... out of 100, which would be 0.4% repeating, right? Or roughly just a little bit less than 0.5%. Okay. Now the other way to do that would be not to do it this way and simply use your division method. So 12 divided by 2,700, 12 divided by 2,700 is 0.00444, which we'll just treat as tenths, 100,000 as 10,000, 100,000, 444 100,000ths, which divided by 1,000, is 0.4 repeating out of 100, or 0.4 repeating percent. Okay, still less than 0.5%. Right, so less than 1%, and actually less than 0.5% of that ore is made up of gold. So 99.5 repeating percent of that ore is not gold. Okay, hopefully that helped you. If you have any questions, make sure you ask.